25. We're going to start in verse 13. I'm going to read 13 to 22, although we're going to talk about the story through Acts 26, but I'm not going to read that all to you. You get to read that on your own. So I'm going to read Acts 25, 13 through 22. And after some days, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to greet Festus. When they had been there for many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a certain man left a prisoner by Felix, about whom the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me when I was in Jerusalem, asking for a judgment against him. To them I answered, it is not the custom of the Romans to deliver any man to destruction before the accused meets the accusers face to face, and has the opportunity to answer for himself concerning the charges against him. Therefore, when they had come together without any delay, the next day I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought in. When the accusers stood up, they brought no accusation against him of such things as I supposed, but had some questions against him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who had died, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. And because I was uncertain of such a question, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there be judged concerning the religious matters. And when Paul appealed to be reserved for the decision of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, "I would like to hear the man myself." "Tomorrow," he said, "you shall bring him to me." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God for his word today. Well, to catch us up to the story, we're journeying with Paul. Paul had gone back home to Jerusalem, ready to retire and quit his missionary missions of starting new churches. But he finds trouble in Jerusalem, and the Jerusalem Council of priests and elders want him out. So they have the Roman soldiers put him under arrest. He's then sent to the governor Felix, who is the governor of that area, to be seen and to be tried. Well, Felix, we learned last week, was not a very good man. He was a corrupt man. He was a vicious man. And he wanted nothing to do with Paul because that meant that he would have to do something. You know, we have some politicians in our world today who just like to talk but don't really want to do anything that needs to be done. So we ended the chapter, last week's chapter, with Felix saying, "I'm not doing anything with him. I'm going to just put him up in King Herod's palace and imprison him for 2 years, and then I'm going to turn him over to the next governor." So as we come into this new chapter, we meet the new governor. His name is Festus. And he's a much nicer guy than Felix was. But it had been 2 years that Paul has been imprisoned, not being able for anybody to hear his case. But we have to remember that the Jewish council had heard his case. The Roman government has already heard his case. Nobody can find anything wrong that Paul has done. But nobody wants to let him go because they know he's going to be killed as soon as he's let go. And neither side wants that on their conscience. So Paul's been held up in a palace for the last 2 years, waiting for somebody to make a final decision. Here comes Festus. And Festus knows that he needs to take care of this problem quickly. And so at the beginning part of chapter, it talks about how Festus knows he needs to get there to deal with this, to Caesarea. And he really wants Paul to go back to Jerusalem, which is where the charges originated. He doesn't want to deal with it in Caesarea. He wants him gone too. He doesn't want anything underneath his realm. But he's also got a heart. Festus is a good man. He wants to do what's right, but he also needs to save his own hide. Sounds like some politicians today, doesn't it? They're going to do whatever they can to save their own hide, even if that means not doing what they know is right to do. So 2 years, poor Paul's been waiting. And now they have a new governor. And Paul's sure, okay, now's when I'm going to finally get to be heard. Well, Festus doesn't know really what to do. So he invites his friend, King Agrippa. Now, if you know King Agrippa, he's one of Herod's 6 children. We've talked about these King Herods before. Remember, King Herod the Great was the one who asked for all of the children under the age of 2 to be killed when Jesus was born, hoping that Jesus would be killed, right? That was the great-grandfather. And then the grandfather was the one, King Antipas, that we've talked about, was the one who had John the Baptist beheaded. And then father, King Agrippa I, was the one who had James the Apostle, the brother of John, killed. And now here we have this King Herod Agrippa II, who has this long lineage of knowing about who Jesus is. And now he's got Paul at his court. Now, King Agrippa II was not a king. He called himself a king because he felt like he deserved that title because his ancestors had that title. Really, King Agrippa II was only a governor, just like Festus was, just for 2 different jurisdictions. So King Agrippa had no authority above Festus. They had equal authority. But King Agrippa thought a lot of himself. He had all this heritage to look up to that helped him to see that, you deserve everything. So King Agrippa asked for Paul to come before him. And so the text continues on to say that they entered into this big auditorium, this big place where they would be able to sit up on a throne, be like, this stage elevated even more and thrones sitting there so that Agrippa could sit there and Bernice, who I'll get to in a minute, and Festus could sit there above the crowds, looking all regal to hear Paul's words. They entered into this place with great pomp and circumstance because Agrippa thought he was everything. Now, who was Bernice? Remember how I told you that Agrippa wasn't a good guy? Well, Bernice was his sister, who called herself the queen, because if Agrippa was going to call himself the king, then his sister Bernice might as well be called the queen. Well, Queen Bernice had buried a couple of husbands and had found herself now living with her brother, and some say that it was an incestuous relationship. So we're not talking about good moral people here. But yet Festus, who's a good guy, relies on Agrippa to be just a sounding board. I just wanted you to come hear his story so you can tell me what you think, because Agrippa, you know the Jewish heritage. You know these old prophet stories. Festus did not. So he really wanted Agrippa to come along and say, all right, here's what's true, here's what's not. Well, Agrippa wanted to make it all about himself. So with the pomp and the circumstances of coming into the court, he hears what Paul has to say. Now, there are a lot of other people in the audience. A lot of, they say, officials and authority figures. And so Paul now has an audience to be able to share. So Paul, I love this part of the story. Paul starts from the very beginning. And Agrippa and Bernice and Festus have to just sit back and listen as Paul takes the whole next chapter to lay out his entire life story. From the time being born as a Jew, to Roman citizens, to his childhood growing up knowing the scriptures, to the time when he went and became a Jewish leader himself and was a part of the Sanhedrin. He was a pretty high-ranking Jewish figure. Paul goes on to tell him, he says, but then I turned corrupt, and I went after the Christians. I went after those who are doing the very thing that I'm doing. For those that spoke the truth, I went after them. I was one of you, he kept telling them. He wanted them to know he knows exactly where their hearts are at. He also reminded them that you don't yet know Jesus. And then he went on to tell in length the story of his Damascus journey, where he went and he saw the bright light and he saw Jesus and he heard Jesus' voice saying, you are going to be one of my servants. I anoint you to go out and to tell the truth. And Paul goes on and on and on and on with his story. He's got a captive audience. Nobody's going anywhere. And he goes into the story about how Jesus changed his life and he became a new person. That all those old ways were gone and he was ready to be a new life and to share that life of Christ with others. He had an open opportunity. And he had hoped upon hope that Agrippa would say, yeah, I know those old stories you're talking about. I can see where you have changed and I believe in you. But Agrippa couldn't do that. Because if he would go and side with Paul, that would in his mind meant that he denounced all of the heritage of the King Herods before him. All of those generations of people who hated Jesus. If Agrippa were to go with Paul, he would have to renounce his own being. And it makes me think how many times in our lives have we not stood up to what we believe in because of fear of what somebody else might think? Now, I don't think we've ever done it to the degree that Agrippa has or that Paul has, but I think there's probably been times when it's just easier not to share our faith than to share it with somebody who is so boldly against it. We know people in our lives that are very firm in, I don't believe in God, you're not going to convince me, show me the proof. And instead of standing up and being bold like Paul and sharing the truth, we tend to just say, well, you know, you got to believe it for yourself. Go read the scriptures. And there's another part of this story, too. It's the fact that Paul had waited 2 years to be heard over something so small. The only real charge that they could bring against Paul was that he preached that Jesus was the Messiah, that he died and rose again and still walks among us as a living being. That was the one thing that they wanted to prove against him. 2 years, these Jews held on to this anger and this bitterness, this wanting to get revenge against Paul, when many of them didn't even know what Paul had done. They were just so caught up in the movement of being angry and revengeful that they thought, well, we've got to go after him because that's what so-and-so told me to do. And it makes me wonder, am I still holding on to any bitterness from somebody that may have wronged me? Because I think sometimes we do that. We hold on to things, the hurts, the things that are said, the things that are done, when it's only hurting us. And it's okay to forgive, but we still are not going to forget. And sometimes those triggers come back and they get at us and they remind us of all those things that happened, and we need to have restitution for that. That's what these Jews have been doing to Paul for 2 years, or even longer than that. They didn't even know what they were arguing about anymore. But they just knew that Paul had done something wrong and he needed to pay for it. So what happens in our story? Absolutely nothing. Paul's still a prisoner. Agrippa does nothing. Paul doesn't want to go back to Jerusalem. Paul demands that if you want to continue to hold me, You have to send me back to the Roman government. You need to send me to Caesar. The head of all heads. Take me to the top. Take me to the Supreme Court, is what he's asking for. Take me to the top layer of government officials and let them hear my case. Well, Agrippa and Festus both knew that Paul had done nothing wrong. So they claim at the end of that chapter 26 that, well, since he asked to go see the Caesar, let's send him to Caesar. And they washed their hands of him. So now we put another pin in our story as we send him next week to see King Caesar. But yet, I just want us to remember that throughout all this journey of Paul, all of this imprisonment, all of the journeys that he has taken, all of this waiting, the churches that he started are thriving. That they want to stop Paul from this movement, but yet the movement has already taken off. And the churches are growing. New churches are being started because of the people that Paul poured into are now going out and leading. It doesn't revolve around Paul anymore. It doesn't have to, because Paul has done his job to reach the churches and to reach the people to continue to move the message of Christ. That's what we get to do. We get to continue to be the messengers of the truth of Christ. We get to continue to lead Paul's example by not giving up, to allow God to work through him, allow God to work through us to share that message of truth. That's what we're to do. So that's what we're going to do the rest of this week, and come back next week to learn about his encounter. All right? We're going to sing our last hymn tonight, Oh, Jesus, I Have Promised. Number 369.